Golden light washed the park as cicadas buzzed, and Lauren said, "I almost skipped my walk today." Jordan slowed near the fountain and said, "Then I would have missed you." A breeze tugged her curls while his camera strap tapped his chest. She laughed softly and said, "You a photographer or a spy?" He grinned and said, "Only when the sky turns this color." Her heartbeat steadied as children shouted in the distance. Lauren said, "I'm Lauren, by the way," and offered a hand. Jordan took it warmly and said, "Jordan, and I'm glad you stayed." They walked toward the sycamores as shadows grew long. She said, "This city feels kinder right now." And he said, "Maybe it's telling us to listen." Morning found them at a corner cafe where windows drank sun, and Lauren said, "I like places that smell like butter and hope." Jordan traced a circle on his mug and said, "Then we ordered right." Steam rose as the street muttered awake. She asked about the camera, and he said, "My uncle taught me to see light, not things." Her smile eased the clatter of cups and plans. Lauren said, "I design murals after my day job," and he said, "Then your colors live outside." A bus sighed and carried strangers to errands. They leaned closer, and time shrank to the table. She said, "Feels easy," and he said, "Feels true." They wandered a brick-lined block where vendors stacked fruit like jewels, and Lauren said, "I learned shade from grapefruit rinds." Jordan laughed and said, "Then oranges are your teachers." A saxophone lilted from a stoop. She pointed at a wall and said, "This could be a sunrise if the city agrees." He lifted his camera and said, "Let me show you how the edges glow." Tires hissed and the day brightened. She said, "Do you always listen this hard?" And he said, "Only when it matters." The sax slid low and sweet. Their shoulders brushed, and the street felt tender. Evening cooled the block as streetlights blinked awake. And Lauren said, "My mother thinks love should be careful." Jordan paused at the crosswalk and said, "Careful can mean caged." A wind skimmed the puddles left by a quick rain. She said, "She measures people with rules," and he said, "We can build better rulers." A car radio spilled a slow jam. Her phone buzzed, and she silenced it. Lauren said, "I want joy without apology," and he said, "Then we'll name it out loud." The light turned, and they crossed into a softer night. They climbed a modest rooftop where antennas pointed like prayers, and Lauren said, "I used to wish on airplanes." Jordan set the camera on the ledge and said, "Let's wish on what we can touch." The sky bruised purple and gold. She said, "I keep waiting for the catch," and he said, "Then I'll keep showing up." Sirens faded to murmurs. Lauren said, "If this grows, it needs sunlight," and he said, "I'll pull the blinds wide." Their breath misted as the air cooled. Hope pooled between them, bright as the last line of day. Lauren returned home to her mother's dining room, where candles flickered against polished wood, and Marjorie said, "Jordan hides truths you can't bear." Lauren frowned and said, "He is not that man." The clink of silverware echoed in a room heavy with history. Marjorie's eyes hardened as she said, "He walks with shadows, and he will shame you." Lauren's throat tightened, and her hand trembled near her glass. She said, "Why would you tell me this?" And Marjorie said, "Because love can blind, and I won't see you ruined." Silence pressed like weight on Lauren's chest. She whispered, "Maybe you're wrong," and Marjorie said, "I'm never wrong." The next day Lauren lingered by the mirror, her reflection blurred with doubt, and she said, "Could love be so fragile?" Her phone buzzed with Jordan's name, and she pressed ignore. The world outside sang with traffic and chatter, but silence ruled her small room. She touched the necklace he gave her and said, "Was it all a trick?" Marjorie's words circled like crows in her head. The mirror showed eyes swollen with tears she fought to hide. She said, "I need truth," and her voice cracked. Alone, she sat on the bed, heart split between hope and betrayal, not knowing which parts to trust. At the cafe where joy once bloomed, Lauren sat with arms crossed, and Jordan said, "You've been distant, what's wrong?" She forced a weak smile and said, maybe I don't know you. His brows furrowed as he leaned closer. He said, where is this coming from? She looked away, eyes damp, and said, someone who knows you better than I do. His hand tightened around the cup, ceramic rattling softly. Jordan said, I've given you nothing but truth. She whispered, I wish I could believe. Silence fell heavier than steam rising between them. "You say well." The moment held both love and fracture, sharp as glass. Night cloaked the street as Jordan walked her home, his steps heavy, and he said, you don't trust me anymore. Lauren wrapped her arms around herself and said, I don't know what's true. The street lamp hummed above their heads, casting halos on wet pavement. He said, then ask me not ghosts. Her breath shivered in the cool air. She said, and what if you lie? And he said, then I'd lose you, and that would kill me. Their shadows stretched long across the sidewalk, side by side yet apart. Lauren's eyes glistened, but her mouth stayed shut. The silence cut sharper than words. Back in her bedroom, Lauren faced Marjorie, who folded arms like armor. Lauren said, he swore he loves me. Marjorie's voice was sharp as glass as she said, love is cheap when built on secrets. Lauren's chest ached with fury and grief. She said, why can't you let me choose? And Marjorie said, because I see danger where you see light. The room tightened with silence until Lauren's tears fell. She said, you want me broken? And Marjorie said, I want you safe. The air carried no comfort. Lauren turned toward the window, heart crumbling, believing the lie that pulled her away. Lauren boarded the bus out of town, her suitcase wedged against her knees, and she whispered, this isn't how I dreamed it. Rain tapped against the glass as the city blurred behind. Jordan's name lit her phone, but she pressed decline. Her heart ached as she said, forgive me for believing lies. Outside, neon lights faded into dark highways. Every bump in the road shook her resolve. She clutched the necklace he gave her, tears spilling quietly. Passengers whispered around her, but she felt utterly alone. She said, maybe distance will silence my love, yet every breath betrayed her hope. Jordan stood in the empty cafe, chairs stacked, lights dimmed. He said, she's gone without a goodbye. His reflection wavered in the window, merging with the street outside. The smell of coffee lingered, but warmth was gone. He clenched the strap of his camera and whispered, I thought love was enough. A barista cleaning nearby paused with pity in her eyes. He forced a smile and said, don't worry, I'll manage. The hum of refrigerators filled the silence. He pressed his forehead to the glass, eyes burning with unshed tears. He said, wherever she is, she'll know I meant every word. Weeks passed as Lauren unpacked in a small apartment, bare walls echoing her loneliness. She said, new city, same heartache. She pressed paint samples against the wall, but none felt alive. The sun lit dust motes that floated without direction. She held her sketchbook but couldn't draw a single line. Her phone lay silent, Jordan's absence heavy. She said, I thought leaving would bring peace. Her voice cracked as she whispered, but love stains even silence. The refrigerator hummed like a hollow drum. She curled into herself on the couch, fighting tears that refused to be buried. Jordan wandered a riverside path at dusk, camera hanging unused. He said, what's the point if she's not here to see? The river shimmered under fading light, carrying whispers of memory. He snapped a photo, then dropped the camera to his chest with a sigh. He said, even beauty feels hollow now. Joggers passed, laughter trailing, but he walked alone. He paused at the bridge where they once stood together. His breath fogged in the cool air. He whispered, I'll wait even if she never returns. The river rolled on, steady and merciless, like the ache in his chest. One night Lauren dreamed of Jordan, his voice echoing, I'll always be near. She woke breathless, clutching sheets. Moonlight spilled through blinds, silver against her skin. She whispered, why can't I forget you? Her chest ached as memories flooded, his smile, his steady hands, the way he believed in her art. She pressed her palm to the cold window. The city beyond felt strange and hollow. Tears blurred the skyline into streaks of sorrow. She said, "You live inside me still." In the silence she broke, knowing no lie could erase the truth of her love. Months later, Lauren walked through a crowded gallery where colors burned brighter than her smile. She said, "I thought new walls could heal me." Paintings shouted life, yet her chest carried silence. She trailed fingers across a canvas, remembering Jordan's words about light. A stranger admired her sketches and said, "You see the world in fire and tenderness." She nodded faintly, unable to voice his absence. Laughter swelled around her, but she stood adrift. She whispered, "Still, he lingers." In that moment, the city felt smaller, as if fate was folding her back toward what she lost. Meanwhile, Jordan taught photography to kids in a community center filled with chalk dust and laughter. He said, "Look for truth in shadows." A boy lifted the camera and smiled, catching a friend's grin. Jordan's voice softened as he said, "Art saves when nothing else does." Pride swelled, but sorrow trailed his steps. He glanced at the window, as if Lauren might appear in the frame. He whispered, "You'd love this," but the air answered with silence. Hope flickered faintly in his chest, but emptiness still claimed the room. Lauren visited a mural in progress, brushes in her pocket, paint staining her palms. She said, "This wall deserves hope." Colors rose under her strokes like dawn breaking. Yet Jordan's laughter haunted the rhythm of her hand. She wiped sweat from her brow and whispered, "Would he be proud of this?" Neighbors passing offered cheers, but her heart ached hollow. She stood back, seeing the sunrise painted bold, and said, "Maybe this can carry me forward." But inside she knew her art still bent toward him, the missing half of her canvas. At twilight, Jordan lingered at a bookshop window where photographs of cityscapes lined the glass. He said, "She'd call these too perfect." His reflection trembled with streetlight glow. He carried a notebook filled with ideas he'd never share. A woman nearby said, "You look like you lost something," and he answered softly, "Someone." The neon buzzed above his head as he traced the edge of a photo. He whispered, "Her colors still find me." The city moved around him, but he remained still, tethered to memory. One evening fate teased them close. Lauren crossed a busy plaza while Jordan exited a cafe nearby. She said, "Just another night," clutching her bag tighter. At that same moment, Jordan adjusted his strap, eyes scanning the crowd. They passed within heartbeats, their shoulders brushing as strangers streamed between them. Lauren's pulse raced as she whispered, "That felt like him." Jordan turned half a step, frowning at the familiar warmth. The city swallowed them in noise before truth could surface. Both walked away, carrying echoes of what almost was. Lauren visited her childhood home on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the air heavy with memories. She said, "I don't know why I came back." Marjorie poured tea and said, "Because you finally see the truth." Lauren's eyes narrowed as she replied, "Or maybe I see the cracks." The ticking clock filled the silence until Lauren asked, "Why did you hate him so much?" Marjorie's lips tightened as she said, "He wasn't meant for you." Lauren whispered, "Or he wasn't meant for your plans." Her chest burned with suspicion, and for the first time, doubt shifted toward her mother. Later, Lauren searched the attic, dust rising as boxes groaned with secrets. She muttered, "What are you hiding?" Old letters spilled across the floor, and one envelope bore Jordan's name. She gasped, reading words he never knew she'd missed. The letter spoke of his devotion, sealed but never delivered. Her hands shook as she said, "She kept this from me." Shadows pressed around her, but truth cracked open like lightning. She whispered, "He never lied." Anger and sorrow surged together, breaking through her mother's carefully built cage. The lie had stolen years she could never reclaim. Confrontation shook the kitchen as Lauren held the letter like a blade. She said, "You lied to me." Marjorie's face stiffened as she replied, "I protected you." Lauren's voice broke as she said, "From love." The kettle hissed on the stove, drowning her tears. Marjorie slammed her palm on the counter and said, "That boy was never enough." Lauren's chest heaved as she whispered, "He was more than enough." The silence afterward cracked their bond like glass. Lauren turned away, clutching the proof close. Her steps echoed with fury and freedom rising inside her. Lauren sat in her car, under the weight of night, letter trembling on her lap. She whispered, "You loved me all along." Streetlights blurred through tears as engines hummed around her. She gripped the wheel and said, "I have to find him." Her heart thumped with new resolve. The lie that once bound her had lost its power. She wiped her face with her sleeve, eyes shining with determination. She said, "No more silence." For the first time in months, her chest felt alive with possibility. The road stretched ahead, wide and waiting. Lauren returned to the mural she once painted, sunrise spread across brick, and said, "This was always for him." The colors glowed brighter under night lamps, like fire refusing to die. She pressed the letter against her chest and whispered, "I'll make it right." The city hummed steady, but her pulse raced with purpose. For the first time, hope burned louder than fear. She stepped back, gazing at her work, knowing it was both promise and prayer. She said, "I'm coming back to you, Jordan." Her words vanished into the night, carried forward like wings. Late afternoon lit the community center halls, as laughter faded. And Lauren said, "I came to tell the truth." Sneakers squeaked away while posters trembled in the air. Jordan froze by the door and said, "I thought I was a ghost to you." She held the letter like a lifeline and said, "My mother kept this from me." His eyes widened and said, "So the silence was not your choice?" Her breath shook as she said, "I believed her, and it broke us." He looked at the scuffed floor and said, "I begged the days to move." The clock clicked like a metronome of hurt. She stepped closer and said, "I am sorry for every unanswered call." He rubbed the bridge of his nose and said, "I kept the table set anyway." A basketball rolled past like a stray thought. She said, "I should have trusted what we made." He said, "I should have asked harder and sooner." Her chest trembled as she said, "Will you hear the rest with me?" He nodded and said, "Let's start by breathing." They stood in a small hush while hope tested its legs. They walked to the park where first light once found them, and Lauren said, "I carried fear like a badge." Autumn leaves whispered as the fountain mist rose. Jordan sat on the bench edge and said, "I carried waiting like work." She unfolded the letter and said, "You wrote about faith I did not honor." He traced the wood grain and said, "I wrote to the future we promised." A stroller creaked by, and the moment held. She said, "Marjorie told me you hid a life that would shame me." He met her eyes and said, "My life is simple, and it is yours to see." Wind teased her curls, as a gull skimmed the water. She said, "I let her voice drown mine." He said, "Your voice is the one I believed." A boy tossed bread and geese argued at the rim. She said, "I want to repair what I broke." He said, "Then bring truth even when it stings." She drew a breath that reached her ribs. He opened his palm and said, "No more guesses, only light." Their hands found middle ground where the bench did not creak. They turned onto the block with her mural blazing like dawn, and Lauren said, "This wall carried your name when mine failed." The colors lifted her voice as if paint could breathe. Jordan lifted his camera and said, "Let me see you beside your sunrise." She laughed through a tear and said, "Make sure the light forgives me." He framed her carefully and said, "The light never held a grudge." A bus muttered by and left them in a hush. She said, "I want to move slow and honest." He lowered the camera and said, "I want steady more than grand." A neighbor waved from a stoop, and the street smiled. She said, "There will be days when doubt knocks again." He said, "We will answer together or not at all." The letter rustled in her pocket like a vow. She said, "I will not hide hard news or tender fear." He said, "I will not let silence do the talking." She stepped into frame and held his gaze. He clicked once, sealing a softer beginning. Evening settled in a corner cafe where steam braided with talk, and Lauren said, "We should set rules for our hearts." Cups clinked like tiny bells on wood. Jordan leaned in and said, "Let us start with no secrets." She nodded and said, "If fear visits, I will name it." He traced a ring of water and said, "If anger arrives, I will not hide it under charm." A neon sign hummed above the door. She said, "Weekly check-ins, even when we are fine." He smiled a little and said, "Especially when we are fine." A server passed with honey and mint. She said, "I will talk to Marjorie without letting her steer me." He said, "I will stand with you but not between you." The hum of the grinder filled a thoughtful beat. She said, "We forgive in steps and we keep records of grace." He said, "We will make a ledger that never closes." Warmth settled like a blanket around the table. She breathed easier as the night eased open. They climbed the familiar rooftop where the city hummed like a choir, and Lauren said, "This is where I almost chose fear." The air smelled of rain and cut metal. Jordan set the camera down and said, "This is where I choose you again." Far traffic threaded the dark like fireflies. She lifted her chin and said, "I forgive my silence, and I ask for yours." He stepped near and said, "I forgive the distance and the hours that ate us." The wind pressed their jackets into their ribs. She said, "I want love that reaches for daylight even at night." He said, "I will open every blind we find." A siren wailed and faded to a sigh. She said, "If the past knocks, we will answer together." He said, "If the future shakes, we will hold the frame." Their foreheads met, and the city softened. She whispered his name like a prayer that stayed. He whispered hers like a door that opened. The sky kept their promise and did not argue. Late afternoon soaked the living room in patient light as Lauren faced the doorway, and Jordan stood beside her like steadied breath. Marjorie folded her arms, then let them fall, and she said, "You brought him back." Lauren kept her voice even and said, "I brought truth back." The clock ticked like a distant drum that refused to hurry. Marjorie stared at the floor and said, "I wanted security for you, not storms." Jordan's gaze held humble, and he said, "I would rather build roofs than hide rain." The room held their histories like dust that never settled. Lauren touched the letter and said, "You caged me with fear." Marjorie winced and said, "I thought fear would teach you caution." Lauren shook her head and said, "Fear only taught me how to leave." Jordan drew a deeper breath and said, "I love your daughter with work and with rest." Marjorie blinked hard as old pride cracked. She said, "I believed lies about him because they soothed me." Lauren stepped closer and said, "Choose truth now, even if it stings." Silence bent, then finally released a tired sigh. They moved to the kitchen where steam rose from an untouched kettle, and Lauren said, "I need boundaries and love together." Marjorie rubbed her temples and said, "I can learn both if you help me." The linoleum held quiet, as if listening for a better script. Jordan rested his hand on the chair back and said, "I will not make you my enemy." Marjorie searched his face and said, "Then be my partner in her peace." Lauren exhaled, the breath tasting like new weather. She said, "We will visit on Sundays, but decisions are ours." Marjorie nodded, pride thinning to humility, and she said, "I will measure less and welcome more." The kettle finally clicked and broke the stale hush. Jordan poured tea and said, "Let us toast to honest alarms." Lauren smiled through a shimmer and said, "To alarms that wake, not warn." Marjorie pressed a napkin to her eyes and said, "I am sorry for the winter I made." The apology settled like warmth where cold once ruled. A week later, the block gathered at the mural where color rose like singing, and Lauren said, "This wall is our second beginning." Children pointed at the rays while neighbors clapped time with their palms. Jordan lifted his camera, then lowered it, and he said, "I want to stand in the picture with you." She laughed and tugged him forward, heart loosening in public light. Marjorie lingered near the curb and said, "Your sunrise feels like a door I can open." Lauren squeezed her hand and said, "Walk through as you are." The crowd hushed as she spoke about truth that survives storms. Jordan said, "We name our love out loud so silence cannot steal it." A breeze pressed the paint to a brighter glow, as if blessing their vows. Lauren looked up and said, "Thank you for staying when I left." Jordan's smile reached the corners that sorrow once kept. He said, "We were always walking back to here." Applause rose like wings and carried them higher than fear. At the riverside that evening, the city hummed like a patient choir, and Lauren said, "Tell me your tender plans." Jordan rested elbows on the rail and said, "A small studio with big windows and plants that forgive neglect." The river carried dusk as if it knew their names by heart. She said, "Workshops for kids where cameras and paint trade secrets." He nodded with a grin that felt like returning home. She said, "Monthly dinners with Marjorie so we practice grace." He touched her knuckles and said, "And weekend walks that listen more than talk." A fairy horn folded distance into nearness. She said, "When fear knocks, we answer together." He said, "When joy visits, we set a bigger table." The lights along the water bloomed one by one like steady promises. She leaned into his shoulder and said, "We choose the long kindness, not the quick win." He whispered, "We make our vows daily and keep them nightly." The dark held them without asking for proof. At sunrise under the sycamores, the air tasted like beginnings, and Lauren said, "We started here with guesses." Jordan watched the light climb her face and said, "We finish guessing and start choosing." The path shone with dew that made each step glow. She placed a small ring on his palm and said, "No diamonds, just a daily promise." He slipped a braided band onto her finger and said, "No spectacle, only steadiness." Birds stitched a melody that felt like scripture in motion. She said, "I will not let silence speak for me again." He said, "I will not let pride sit in your chair." Their foreheads met, and the city hushed to listen. She laughed softly and said, "Love is work and play, not either or." He breathed her in and said, "Then we clock in with joy." The sun cleared the leaves and poured gold into their held hands. Together they stepped forward, bright as forgiveness and sure as morning.